Welcome to INSS English Podcast. I'm Adi Kantor. Since October 7th and during 8 months of war in Gaza, Israel-US relations have known moments of true partnership as well as moments of crisis. President Joe Biden is reportedly one of the only two US presidents to have given serious consideration to a defense treaty with Israel. In a new memorandum titled A U.S.-Israeli Defense Treaty, The Time Has Come, INSS senior researchers Professor Freilich and Colonel retired Eldad Shavit analyze the pros and cons of the bilateral defense treaty from both the Israeli and the American perspectives and propose ways of addressing the sides' concerns. With me in the Zoom today is Professor Freilich, the co-author of the book. Chuck is former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel and a senior researcher at INSS. He's also the author of Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy, published in Cornell in 2012, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change, published in Oxford in 2018, and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power, published last year in Oxford. Chuck, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The U.S.-Israeli relations have gone through a major crisis in the past months. It's not a secret. Why even considering a defense treaty with Israel precisely now, at a time where the relations are in such a state? Do you think it even has chances to happen, this treaty?
Well, that's a really great question. And because you're a polite person, you didn't ask me if I fell on my head and suffer from some mental deficiency, which of course is a possibility, but I don't think it's demonstrated by this study that we did. The US is trying to put forth a tripartite grand bargain in the Mideast today, the focus of its national policy towards the US, towards the Middle East. And the idea is that in exchange for a US defense treaty with the Saudis and some other things that the Saudis want, basically unlimited arms sales and recognition of their civil nuclear program, in exchange for those three things, the Saudis will normalize relations with Israel. But they also want something from Israel, not just from the US. They want us to go forward on the Palestinian front. Now, so far, the prime minister, the current Israeli government, does not seem to be willing to buy into that plan. Not that it doesn't want the normalization with the Saudis, it does, but it's not willing to, so to speak, pay the price on the Palestinian front. Now, we in INSS believe that the normalization deal, this package will actually enable the emergence of a new security architecture in the Middle East. It won't be NATO, but it will be an informal alignment of countries against Iran and its proxies, led by the US with the participation of the Saudis, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, other Arab states, maybe France and Britain, Israel. And we saw, by the way, this alignment, how successfully it operated on April 23rd when Iran launched a major strike against Israel. Well, we think that it is critical that this alignment go forward as much as possible. We think that normalization with the Saudis will really open up the Middle East to partnership with Israel and with the broader Muslim world in ways that we never saw before. But as I was saying, the prime minister has not been willing to buy into this. And so one of the objectives here, we would have proposed this in any event. But the question, why now, is we want to really provide a strong sweetener for the prime minister. It's both a strategic sweetener, a defense treaty with the United States, and a political sweetener that may help him sell the deal, so to speak, to the Israeli public.
This is not a new idea. It was discussed in the past. Can you maybe share with our audience when, by who, and what was the background?
As a matter of fact, Israel's founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, was the first to give consideration to this and to try and pursue it, and the US wasn't interested. I'm talking about the 1950s. And the idea basically lay in the background until the late well, the early and then late 90s, because both Prime Minister Rabin and then Prime Minister Barak, who had really put dramatic proposals on the table for peace agreements with the Palestinians and the Syrians. And they were looking into the possibility of a defense treaty, not because they thought that Israel really needed it so much. Yes, it would have been nice for defense purposes, but primarily, again, because they thought that this might be a way to sell it to sell the concessions that Israel would be making to the Palestinians or to the Syrians, to the Israeli public. The next prime minister to think about it was Mr. Netanyahu, and he played with the idea very briefly, and Trump also played around with it. It was basically a political maneuver during the, I think it was one of the last rounds of elections. I forget, a couple of rounds ago. I forget which one it was. And over the years, some people in the defense establishment have considered it. The interesting thing here is that the Israeli defense establishment has always been against a defense treaty, not because they didn't.
My next question: Why did it oppose until now so much?
I'll answer the question now. It's not that they didn't want deep, as a matter of fact, as deep as possible strategic cooperation with the U.S. They did. They didn't want to formalize it in a defense treaty. Well, there were a few factors, but maybe the number one concern was that it would possibly constrict Israel's freedom of maneuver or independence of action, which has always been one of the fundamental pillars of Israel's national security strategy. We defend ourselves by ourselves, don't want to be bound by external constraints. And I think that's, well, there were a couple of other concerns. For example,
just to
Sure.
enter just in for a minute, aren't we constrained already now without a treaty? Do we need a treaty to be constrained? I mean, it's part of the relations, isn't it?
You're exactly right, and that's of course one of our primary arguments for a defense treaty, is that we're bound by really an endless array of ties with the U.S. and constraints with the U.S. And the question is whether a defense treaty would significantly increase that.
Okay.
And our conclusion is not significantly or fundamentally. And to be honest, or to be frank, I must say that there are some people, smart people who've been in top positions in Israel who disagree with that. But I think if you look at the history of U.S.-Israeli relations in, let's say, the last 50 or so years since the special relationship developed, there have hardly been any occasions of consequence in which we have not first consulted with the U.S. And when you consult with the U.S., that basically means asking for a green light. We didn't always get the green light, but at least it was yellow, or at least we perceived it to be such. There are very few occasions when we didn't do that, certainly on major strategic decisions. Now, I think the concern is really about some more lower level, below the radar type of things that we do, which can be very important. And yes, that could constrain us in some ways. There are no free lunches in life, and you have to decide what's better, the overall benefits of a defense treaty with the U.S. or the fact that you will pay some price. We think it'll be limited. Let's
talk about the pros and cons. Because you mentioned it, of course, in your publication. What are the pros and cons for Israel, and pros and cons for the U.S.? And of course, we take under consideration that it's far from being symmetrical. I mean, there's an asymmetric system between the U.S. and Israel. Let's begin with the U.S. What are the reasons for them to say yes? How would they benefit from such a treaty?
Well, I think there are a couple of advantages and disadvantages that play to both sides. So I'll start with that, and then I'll just say the U.S. side. I think for both the U.S. and Israel today, if we can form this new strategic architecture that I was talking about before, now there's a regional alliance led by the U.S. with the Saudis, other Gulf states, Arab states, and Israel against Iran, that would actually be the ultimate victory in the war in Gaza. Not the ultimate victory that the prime minister has talked about, Ultimate military victory in that sense doesn't exist, but this would be. And remember, one of the primary reasons, not the only, but one of the primary reasons that Hamas started this war to begin with Iran's backing, was to derail this architecture, which was already in the making. So that's one reason. Well, second reason is very closely related to it. We want the regional normalization, right? It's important for economic reasons, for political reasons. Okay. For the US, first of all, Israel's conventional military capabilities exceed those of almost all other American allies. If you put aside the British and French nuclear arsenals, Israel's conventional capabilities exceed theirs. More aircraft, more tanks, etc. Second of all, the US believes, or I think would believe, that a defense treaty as part of this security architecture would lead to greater regional security, ultimately lead to a decreased need for American intervention, or certainly involvement, certainly intervention in the region at a time when they want to focus their efforts on China and Russia. This would constitute a major setback for China and Russia in the region as part of the overall global competition between the superpowers, and both China and Russia have made inroads into the region in recent years. It might, over time, facilitate a phase out of US military assistance to Israel. Of course, that raises concerns on the Israeli side, but I think that's something that we're going to, a demand for that is something we're going to face at some point in the not distant future in any event. And maybe this is a way to address it proactively. I think there are two primary disadvantages from an American perspective. Actually, the first one is a shared concern. Both Israel and the US, the primary reason that they might not want the defense treaty is the loss of, potential loss of freedom of maneuver, of independent operation. In Israel's case, as I said, because we'd be concerned about being constrained more. In the US case, it's because their concern would be that a defense treaty would force them to support Israel in all sorts of situations in which they might not want to do so. And then it might conflict with some other interests in the region and beyond. Both sides, by the way, also have to take into account the Chinese and Russian reactions to a defense treaty, because they will feel threatened by it. And one of the, it's not that they're going to go to war.
Not just China and Russia. I mean, also regional threats. Iran might, I don't know how.
Of course, right. And the fear is that it would lead to Russia and China strengthening their already growing ties with Iran.
How much is such a treaty dependent on the construction of the current government in Israel and the US administration? I mean, we are headed towards elections in the US. How do you see, how much is it dependent on the election? If whether there will be an election in Israel in the upcoming year? Is it something that is dependent on election at all, on the way the government looks like, or it crosses governments? What do you think?
Most countries would leap at the opportunity for a defense treaty with Israel. And that's why we decided to add this as a sweetener for the current government to help it overcome its hesitations on the Palestinian issue, to enable this overall package to emerge. I don't know that the Israeli government is going to adopt our idea. Certainly if, as looks increasingly possible, the National Unity Party, Mr. Gantz and Eisenkot, leave the coalition in a week from now. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that the US is rapidly approaching the presidential elections. I mean, there's no reason that this couldn't happen a day before the elections or a week before the elections, but the administration's attention, its focus will be entirely on electoral factors within a matter of weeks. So
And in the case that Trump wins, what are the chances for such a treaty to be signed?
Trump has already expressed his, shall we say, lack of enthusiasm for NATO, for binding American commitments. I don't know that he would be terribly thrilled to adopt this idea of a new bilateral commitment. And remember, there's no commitment the US can make that is stronger than a defense treaty. But it's early to, I think, to assess what he would do. You could make the argument that he might like this very much. I think it's less likely.
Mm-hmm.
For Israel, maybe the most important thing about it, there are two things. We started looking at this issue a year ago. And at the time, the primary reason that we were interested in this is because we wanted to find a long-term way of guaranteeing the strength, the vitality of the relationship, despite the growing areas of friction, despite the fact that we've been talking about a growing crisis in US-Israeli relations. And viewers who may have seen some of our early podcasts will know that for the last year and a half or more, we've been talking about crisis, crisis, crisis. And so we thought this was a way, this won't end the current crisis, but if a treaty came about, it would help to further institutionalize the relationship for the long term, help ensure that future administrations and Congresses will remain committed to the relationship with Israel, because the United States takes its treaty commitments, its international agreements generally very, very seriously. So that was a primary motivation a year ago. At the time, we were also concerned. We didn't feel that Israel needed this for military reasons. We thought that we can handle the threats that we face alone, with the exception of a possible exception of a nuclear Iran. Certainly, if Iran goes nuclear and then we have a cascade and a multi-nuclear Middle East emerges, I mean, that's a nightmare scenario in which we said we would certainly want US help, maybe even just for nuclear Iran. In the interim, what happened is, of course, is October 7th. And it turned out that we need American strategic support backing even in a much lesser scenario. Now, yes, October 7th started because of the total failure on our part. It never should have happened that way. And had it broken out as it should have, then we wouldn't have needed US support, certainly not of this magnitude. But it turns out that we really needed the American intervention to deter the Iranians and Hezbollah. And so we might actually need American help for lesser threats in the future. But we said that since neither country wants to be bound by the truly lesser threats, let's limit the contractual obligation just to existential and severe ones. That kind of wording doesn't appear in other American security guarantees, or defense treaties, but everyone is worded differently.
So, question: how do you define severe?
Well, that's something that the future president or prime minister will have to discuss. But American defense guarantees, actually, people might be surprised, are very ambiguous to begin with. The standard wording is something like the US and the other party will consult on ways to address the threat. Now, that's about as amorphous as it comes, but that is really the kind of binding language that shapes American policy. So if we can get existential, and we can argue over what's existential, but if we can get a commitment to existential and severe, it would be pretty good.
What would you recommend the state of Israel to do now in order to reach such a treaty? What needs to happen from tomorrow? Knowing that in November there are elections, what would you recommend the government to do now?
There's a difference, unfortunately, between what I would recommend and what I think that they will do. And I think we are going, even without the defense treaty, I think we're probably going to miss an opportunity for a strategic transformation of the Middle East. And I'm talking about normalization with the Saudis and an informal alliance with the Arab states and US and others against Iran. And that in and of itself is what word should I use, is a grave mistake and grave setback for Israel's national security strategy. I think if we could add the idea of a defense treaty with the US, that will make the failing on our part that much more severe.
Thank you very much for enlightening us. Thank you and also Eldad Shavit for writing this important publication. Let's hope that the right people will read and hear this podcast, and hope that this treaty will indeed come to life.
Thanks, Adi, for hosting this.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our viewers. Till next time.